On a quiet corner in Howard Beach, Queens, stands a house. It is a two-story structure of brick and siding, with a neatly kept lawn and a modest footprint indistinguishable from the thousands of other homes that form the fabric of this working-class New York neighborhood. The sound of a distant lawnmower, the laughter of children on bicycles, the rustle of leaves in the afternoon breeze, these are the only things that disturb the peace. The house at 85-15 159th Avenue presents itself as a monument to the ordinary, a physical embodiment of suburban tranquility. Today, a family lives within its walls. They mow the lawn, collect the mail, and watch the seasons change through its windows. The property has been returned to its original purpose, reabsorbed into the quiet rhythm of the community it once dominated. Its current state is an exercise in banality, a deliberate erasure of a past that feels almost impossible to reconcile with the placid scene. The house has become a vessel for a new, unremarkable history, its architecture scrubbed clean of the aura that once made it the most watched home in America. Yet, a structure like this does not simply forget. Its foundation holds the memory of a different weight. Its wooden frame still resonates with the echoes of unspoken commands and veiled threats. The silence that now occupies its rooms is not an absence of sound, but a heavy presence, a quiet testament to the stories it has absorbed. The house is a silent witness, a character whose complicity is etched into its very design, a keeper of secrets that the passage of time cannot fully bury. There was an era when this corner was not a backdrop for domestic life, but the epicenter of an undeclared kingdom. During the 1980s, this property was a nerve center, a gravitational point around which the city's underworld revolved. The air here was thicker then, charged with an invisible current of power, fear, and deference. Every car that slowed, every pedestrian who passed, did so with an awareness of what and who this house represented. It was a throne disguised as a family home. Its power was not projected through towering gates or opulent facades. It was a fortress of a different kind, one built not of stone and steel, but of proximity and perception. Its defenses were the eyes of the neighbors, the loyalty of the community it both protected and controlled, and the profound psychological advantage of hiding in plain sight. This was power embedded in the everyday, a dominion asserted not by separating from the world, but by mastering a small, dense corner of it. The sensory landscape of the street was once a carefully orchestrated display. The smell of meticulously manicured grass mingled with the rich scent of leather from the interiors of idling luxury sedans. The polished chrome of these vehicles reflected the modest homes around them, creating a distorted image of two worlds colliding. The constant, quiet presence of men in dark suits, observing the street with unnerving stillness, was the only overt sign that this was not just another house on another block. The building itself seemed sentient, an active participant in the empire it housed. Its windows were not merely panes of glass but unblinking eyes, monitoring the flow of supplicants and adversaries. Its walls were membranes, absorbing the whispers of conspiracy and the weight of fatal decisions. It was a partner in the enterprise, providing a sanctuary of apparent normalcy that allowed the most abnormal of businesses to flourish within. The front door served as the property's most potent symbolic feature. Hewn from dark wood, with polished brass fittings that caught the afternoon sun, it was the critical threshold. It was the boundary between the public performance of a charismatic family man and the private reality of a ruthless sovereign. This door separated the world governed by law from the world governed by loyalty, and the price of crossing it uninvited was absolute. For the television cameras, it was a stage, the backdrop against which a defiant smile and a tailored suit were presented to the world as symbols of invincibility. For the federal agents who watched it for years, it was a portal, the entry point into a network they struggled to map. For the men who served the empire, stepping across its threshold was an act of fealty, an entrance into a space where the rules of the outside world were suspended, and a single man's will was law. Behind that door, the illusion of domesticity was meticulously maintained. The aroma of a home-cooked meal could fill the same air that carried the planning of a multi-million-dollar extortion scheme. Family photographs on the mantelpiece looked down upon meetings that would decide the fate of men. This calculated contrast was the house's greatest strength, a disarming environment where the mundane and the lethal coexisted, making the violence it concealed all the more potent. The decisions made within these rooms did not remain there. They rippled outward, shaping the very skyline of Manhattan, dictating the flow of goods at the city's airports, and silencing those who dared to challenge the established order. This modest home in Queens was the quiet heart of a vast and brutal machine, its domestic shell providing the perfect cover for the systematic corruption it enabled. Now the house stands quiet, its formidable power having evaporated like a morning mist. The fear it once commanded has been replaced by the mild curiosity of true crime tourists and the indifference of a new generation. The structure remains, but its sinister significance has been hollowed out, leaving only an architectural shell. It is a reminder that even the most imposing empires, built on foundations of violence and charisma, are ultimately transient. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside, few dared to know. To understand the full story of the man who ruled from this house and the empire that crumbled around it, subscribe for the complete investigation. Before the house on 159th Avenue became a symbol, it was an answer to a question formed in the crowded, airless tenements of the Bronx, where John Gotti was born, the fifth of 13 children. His early life was a lesson in insignificance, a daily struggle for space, for recognition, for a share of a world that seemed to offer nothing freely. The city was a vertical hierarchy of power, and from his vantage point on the bottom floor, the only view was up. This primal understanding of scarcity and status would become the core of his ambition. The world outside his family's cramped apartment was no less forgiving. The streets were a chaotic theater of survival, governed by unwritten codes of strength and territory. For a young man with little education and fewer prospects, the path of legitimate work was a slow, humiliating climb. The alternative was a ladder of a different sort, one where ascent was measured not in promotions, but in the widening circle of fear one could command. This was the world that shaped him, a landscape that rewarded aggression and punished hesitation. His first forays into crime were not grand strategic moves, but impulsive acts of necessity and assertion. He ran with street gangs like the Fulton Rockaway Boys, engaging in petty theft and street-level intimidation. These were the foundational experiences of power, the discovery that control over a small patch of pavement, over the movements and decisions of others, offered a profound antidote to the powerlessness of his youth. He was learning that respect was not something to be earned through labor, but something to be taken by force. The transition from street tough to organized criminal was a matter of scale, not of principle. His natural charisma and capacity for violence did not go unnoticed. He was recruited into the orbit of the Gambino crime family, where his raw ambition could be refined and directed. Under the tutelage of established mobsters, he learned that true power was not in the act of violence itself, but in the systematic application of its threat. He was no longer just fighting for a corner. He was being inducted into an organization that laid claim to entire industries. This ascent brought him into contact with the established hierarchy of La Cosa Nostra, and with it, a deep-seated resentment. He observed the older generation of bosses, men who had grown distant from the streets that gave them their power. He saw their isolation in suburban mansions as a form of weakness, a disconnect from the raw, daily reality of their enterprise. Their pursuit of a businessman's legitimacy struck him as a betrayal of the gangster's code, a denial of the very violence that underpinned their wealth. The figure of Paul Castellano, the reigning Gambino boss, became a particular focus of this contempt. Castellano ruled from a sprawling, secluded estate on Staten Island, a property known as the White House. To Gotti, this mansion was not a symbol of success, but of arrogance and strategic folly. It was a fortress that broadcasted its own importance while separating its owner from the soldiers who enforced his will. It was a declaration of being above the world, a world Gotti intended to master from within. This critique was the genesis of a counter-vision. The desire for a home, a base of operations, began to take shape in his mind, not as an escape, but as an anchor. He did not want a palace hidden behind acres of trees. He wanted a throne planted firmly on a neighborhood sidewalk. The house he envisioned would be a statement of a different kind of power, one that was accessible, visible, and deeply embedded in the community it controlled. It would be a fortress disguised by its own normalcy. The search for this property was a search for a psychological landscape. Howard Beach, Queens presented the ideal terrain. It was a tight-knit, working-class Italian-American enclave, a place where family ties were strong and suspicion of outsiders was ingrained. It was a neighborhood governed by a fierce local pride, a perfect environment in which to cultivate the blend of loyalty and fear that was his trademark. Here, a powerful man could be seen as a protector, a patriarch rather than a predator. The house at 8515 159th Avenue was not chosen for its grandeur. It was a modest, two-story brick and siding home on a corner lot, indistinguishable from its neighbors. But its very ordinariness was its strategic genius. The corner location offered a commanding view of the surrounding streets, a natural surveillance post. Its placement within a dense residential grid meant that any outside threat, any unfamiliar car or face, would be immediately conspicuous to a network of watchful eyes. Inside, the domestic layout was secondary to its potential function. The rooms were not yet filled with expensive furniture or the artifacts of a criminal enterprise, but the blueprint for their future use was already being drawn. The kitchen would become a boardroom, the living room a waiting area for supplicants, the backyard a private space for conversations too sensitive for any other venue. The structure was a blank canvas onto which an empire's command center could be painted. The acquisition of the house was a pivotal moment, the first material manifestation of a fully formed ideology of power. It was a rejection of the old guard's model of leadership and a declaration of a new one. This was not to be a hideout or a retreat. It was to be an embassy of the underworld, planted openly on the soil of the legitimate world, challenging the authorities to dispute its sovereignty. This house was an investment in a specific kind of invincibility. It was built on the belief that power, when wrapped in the symbols of family and community, becomes almost impossible to assail. The structure was a physical argument that a man could be both a devoted father and a ruthless killer, a friendly neighbor and a feared sovereign. The walls were intended to contain and protect this contradiction. The desire for the house was therefore not about luxury or comfort. It was a profound psychological need, a craving for a permanent, tangible symbol of the status he had fought for. It was the antithesis of the crowded Bronx tenement, a space entirely under his control, where his will would be absolute. The house was the cure for the wounds of his origins, a monument to the boy who had nothing and the man who would take everything. He understood that to control a city, one did not need to own its skyscrapers, but to command its streets. And to command its streets, one needed a central point from which that command could radiate. The house in Howard Beach was designed to be that point, a gravitational center for a network of violence and extortion that would soon span the 5 boroughs. It was a quiet declaration of war, disguised as a mortgage. The purchase was more than a real estate transaction. It was a foundational act. Every nail driven, every tile laid in the coming years would be in service of this grander project. The structure was not merely a place to live, but a weapon to be wielded. Its modest façade was the perfect camouflage for the brutal machinery of power that would soon be installed within. Thus, the quiet corner in Queens was chosen. The seeds of an empire were planted not in the concrete canyons of Manhattan, but in the soft soil of a suburban lawn. The house stood waiting, an empty vessel ready to be filled with secrets, strategies, and the immense, volatile weight of one man's ego. The neighborhood had no idea it was about to become the backdrop for a king. The assassination of Paul Castellano on a cold December evening in 1985 was not just a transfer of power, it was an architectural event. It collapsed the old seat of the Gambino Empire, the secluded White House on Staten Island, and in its place erected a new one. In a single, violent moment, the modest home at 8515 159th Avenue was transformed. It ceased to be a private residence and became the de facto capital of New York's underworld, its symbolic weight shifting as seismically as the city's criminal landscape. The first change was not in brick or mortar, but in the atmosphere that enveloped the property. The quiet suburban corner was suddenly charged with a new energy. The flow of traffic around the house altered, becoming a slow, deferential procession of dark sedans. Men with hard eyes and expensive coats began to materialize on the sidewalk, their stillness a form of living architecture, a human perimeter that announced the presence of a new king. This new status demanded a physical manifestation. The first conquest was control over the city's vast construction industry, a river of concrete and steel that now flowed through the channels Gotti dictated. The profits from this enterprise were not funneled into a hidden offshore account, but reinvested directly into the house itself. The structure began to be fortified, its ordinariness meticulously enhanced into a kind of intimidating perfection. The original wooden front door, a simple feature of a family home, was replaced. In its stead came a heavy, custom-built barrier of dark, polished oak with gleaming brass fittings. This was not merely a door. It was a statement of sovereignty, a formal threshold between the outside world and the inner sanctum. It was the first page of the house's new biography, signaling that what lay behind it was no longer ordinary. As the Gambino family's grip tightened on the freight and cargo unions at JFK Airport, another layer was added. A sophisticated, state-of-the-art security system was installed. Small, discreet cameras, almost invisible to the casual observer, appeared under the eaves of the roof. They were the house's new eyes, unblinking and vigilant, transforming the property from a home into a watchtower that surveyed its domain day and night. The lawn, once a simple patch of green, became a symbol of absolute control. It was manicured with a surgical precision that bordered on the obsessive. Every blade of grass stood at attention. This was not suburban pride, it was a projection of power. It communicated that if a man could exert such flawless dominion over his own small patch of earth, his control over the city's unseen territories was absolute. The power of the house was amplified by its use as a stage for calculated propaganda. The annual 4th of July block parties became legendary. Gotti would preside over the festivities from his front steps, a benevolent patriarch dispensing free food and orchestrating illegal firework displays that dwarfed the city's official shows. The house became a backdrop for a carefully constructed myth, a symbol of a leader who provided for his people in ways the legitimate government could not. This performance of community leadership was a strategic architectural choice. It extended the property's defenses beyond its physical boundaries, creating a buffer zone of neighborhood loyalty. The complicit silence of the residents, born of a mixture of fear and gratitude, became an invisible wall, more effective than any stone fortification. The house was now anchored in the psychology of the community it ruled. Inside, the transformation was even more profound. As Gotti's fame grew with each courtroom acquittal, his ego demanded a more fitting throne room. The modest, middle-class furnishings were systematically replaced. The living room was refurnished with plush, oversized leather sofas and adorned with ornate gilded mirrors, turning a family space into a royal antechamber where capos and soldiers would wait for an audience. The kitchen, the traditional heart of a family home, was repurposed. While meals were still prepared there, its primary function shifted. It became an informal boardroom, the central node of the empire. Around the kitchen table, over cups of espresso, multi-million-dollar extortion schemes were devised, and death sentences were passed down. The scent of garlic and simmering tomato sauce mingling with the cold calculus of murder. The very air within the walls seemed to thicken, saturated with the unspoken rules of this new court. A hierarchy was established in the spatial arrangement of the home. Proximity to the boss was a measure of one's standing. To be invited into the kitchen was to be in the inner circle. To be left waiting in the living room was a clear sign of a lower rank. The house itself began to enforce the protocols of the organization. This duality was the house's defining characteristic. Family photographs shared wall space with the silent weight of criminal conspiracy. The laughter of children in the backyard pool could be heard from a living room where men discussed the brutal realities of loan sharking and hijacking. The house was a masterclass in psychological warfare, its domesticity a disarming veil for the lethal enterprise it contained. Each legal victory, each time Gotti was acquitted and earned the moniker, the Teflon Don, was celebrated with a new layer of opulence. Imported Italian marble was laid in the foyer, its polished surface reflecting the defiant smile of a man who believed himself above the law. The house was not just a home, it was a trophy case, with each luxurious upgrade serving as a monument to a defeated prosecution. The property's aura of invincibility grew in direct proportion to these material enhancements. It became a pilgrimage site for supplicants from across the criminal spectrum and a source of profound frustration for the federal agents who watched it. The house projected a quiet, smug defiance, its perfect facade a daily insult to the authorities, who knew what it concealed but were powerless to penetrate its defenses. The backyard was enclosed by a new high-privacy fence. This was more than a desire for seclusion. It was the creation of a secure, open-air chamber for conversations too sensitive for indoor spaces, away from the threat of electronic surveillance. This act of enclosure was an architectural admission of the secrets the property now had to keep, a final barrier between the inner workings of the empire and the outside world. The fleet of expensive cars parked outside became a permanent part of the landscape. Lincolns, Cadillacs, and Mercedes-Benzes lined the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting the modest homes of the neighbors. This display was the final architectural layer, a constant rotating exhibition of wealth and power that served as a silent, ever-present reminder of who controlled the street. The house had become a living organism, fused to the ego of its owner. It was a physical record of his ascent, each renovation and addition a chapter in his biography of conquest. The structure was no longer passive. It was an active participant in the administration of the empire, a tool of intimidation, a stage for propaganda, and a symbol of a power that seemed, for a time, to be absolute. The perfection of the house was its most sinister quality. It was not a gaudy palace that shouted its importance, but a meticulously maintained home that whispered a far more terrifying message. It suggested that the greatest evil is not that which is monstrous and alien, but that which can seamlessly embed itself within the fabric of the everyday, hiding its brutal nature behind a perfectly painted door. This transformation from a simple house to a suburban fortress was a testament to a singular vision of power. It was a rejection of the isolated mansions of the old guard in favor of a throne planted in the midst of the people. The structure became the ultimate expression of its owner's belief that he was not just a criminal, but a king who ruled from the heart of his community. By the dawn of the 1990s, the house on 159th Avenue had reached its zenith. It was no longer just a building of brick and wood, but an idea made manifest, a symbol of untouchable power, broadcast from a quiet corner in Queens. Its very stillness was a declaration of victory, the silent, confident posture of an empire at the peak of its authority. Which detail best reveals the builder's vanity? The marble ballroom, the bulletproof windows, or the underground vault? At the apex of his reign, the house on 159th Avenue ceased to be a structure and became a state of being. It was the physical embodiment of an ego that had successfully bent a city to its will. Its perfection was no longer an aspiration, but a settled fact, an intimidating constant in the neighborhood's daily life. The paint was never chipped, the lawn was never overgrown, the brass on the front door never tarnished. This was not the quiet pride of a homeowner, but the chilling discipline of a sovereign whose control began with the curb outside his own front door. The property now functioned as a court, with its own intricate rituals and unwritten laws. Mornings were a pageant of power. The dark wooden door would open at a precise time, and the man of the house would emerge, not as a father heading to work, but as a king descending to his chariot. Dressed in a suit that cost more than the cars of his neighbors, he would pause on the top step, a brief, calculated survey of his domain, before gliding into a waiting black sedan. The street held its breath for this daily ceremony. This performance was enabled by a complex, invisible machinery of surveillance. The official security cameras were the least of it. The true defense system was human. Men in parked cars, seemingly idle, were fixed points in a constantly shifting network of observation. Neighbors, through a combination of respect and self-preservation, became extensions of this system, their eyes trained to notice any unfamiliar vehicle, any face that did not belong. The entire block had been transformed into an open-air panopticon. Inside, the house had completed its metamorphosis from a family dwelling into a psychological bunker. The living room, with its plush sofas and family portraits, was a carefully curated antechamber, a space designed to disarm visitors with a facade of domesticity before they were ushered into the true centers of power. It was a waiting room where the currency was anxiety, and the wait itself was a test of loyalty and nerve. The kitchen remained the heart of the operation, a space where the mundane and the lethal were in constant, unsettling dialogue. The aroma of brewing espresso was the backdrop for discussions of bid rigging in the concrete industry. The clatter of plates was the ambient sound for orders that would silence a rival permanently. Here, the contradiction of the owner's identity was most potent, the patriarch and the predator, sharing the same table. The house did not just contain power, it projected it. The annual 4th of July block party was the ultimate expression of this projection. It was a masterful piece of theatre, a carnivalesque display of largesse that dwarfed the city's official celebrations. Illegal, professional-grade fireworks lit up the Queen's sky. Free food was distributed to hundreds, and the boss himself presided over it all from his front lawn, a benevolent lord of the manor. The house was the stage, and the performance was one of a parallel government, more generous and more present than the legitimate one. These events were strategic investments in the property's defense. They transformed neighbors from passive observers into active participants, weaving them into the fabric of the myth. Their complicity, bought with hot dogs and spectacle, created an impenetrable social wall around the house. To inform on its owner was not just to betray a gangster, but to betray the man who brought a day of impossible joy to their working-class street. Yet, for all its outward-facing performance, the house was fundamentally a fortress designed to keep the world out. The high-privacy fence in the backyard was not just for seclusion, it created a sterile zone for communication, a space believed to be free of the government's electronic ears. It was an admission of paranoia, a physical line drawn against an unseen enemy that was always listening, always watching. The rituals of security became a form of imprisonment. The owner could no longer take a simple walk around the block. Every departure was a coordinated tactical movement. Every arrival was a sweep. The house, his ultimate symbol of freedom from the constraints of his youth, had become a gilded cage, its perimeter defined by the reach of his own bodyguards. The man who controlled the city was a prisoner of a single corner lot. Luxury, once a symbol of arrival, now served as insulation, wrapping the inhabitants in a thick blanket of isolation. The imported marble in the foyer was cold to the touch. The oversized leather furniture swallowed conversation. The house was so perfectly sealed, so meticulously controlled, that it began to feel airless, a hermetic environment where the only reality was the one the owner decreed. This isolation bred a grotesque feedback loop. Surrounded only by those whose survival depended on his approval, the owner's narcissism calcified. The house became an echo chamber, where his pronouncements were received as gospel and his worst impulses were validated. It was no longer a home where a family lived, but a shrine where a myth was worshipped by a captive congregation. The contrast between the interior and exterior worlds grew starker. Outside, the vibrant, chaotic life of New York City roared on. Inside, a heavy, artificial silence reigned, broken only by the hushed tones of supplicants or the forced laughter of courtiers. The house was a bubble of absolute authority, floating untethered from the consequences and realities of the world it exploited. The material objects within its walls took on a sinister weight. They were not just possessions, but trophies of a war waged against the legitimate world. A gilded mirror did not just reflect a room, it reflected a courtroom victory. An expensive watch was not a timepiece, but a monument to a silenced witness. The entire decor was a curated exhibition of impunity. The structure itself seemed to develop a personality, smug, defiant, and untouchable. Its clean brick facade was a mask of respectability. Its brightly lit windows at night were a challenge to the federal agents who sat in dark cars down the street, watching a life they could document but not penetrate. The house taunted them with its sheer, unapologetic normalcy. Power was measured in spatial terms. To be invited past the living room and into the kitchen was to be admitted into the inner sanctum. To be met on the front steps was a sign of dismissal. The architecture of the house was a physical diagram of the organization's hierarchy, and every man who entered knew precisely where he stood based on how far he was allowed to penetrate its depths. The domesticity was the most terrifying weapon of all. The sight of the boss's children playing by the backyard pool served as a constant, implicit reminder of what was at stake. It humanized the monster, making his capacity for violence all the more chilling. It suggested a man for whom family was sacred and for whom the protection of that family could justify any atrocity. This fortress, however, was built on a foundation of human frailty. Its strength was derived from codes of silence and loyalty, concepts that are notoriously unstable under pressure. The house was designed to repel external assault, but it had no defense against the corrosion of betrayal that could begin from within. Its walls could stop a bullet, but not a whisper. The grotesque nature of this reign was in its performance of the American dream. It took the nation's most cherished ideals, a family home, a well-kept lawn, community spirit, and perverted them into the infrastructure of a criminal enterprise. The house was a dark mirror held up to suburban aspiration, revealing the violence that can hide behind a perfectly painted front door. The owner, insulated by layers of steel, loyalty, and luxury, came to believe in his own permanence. The house was his legacy, a monument he believed would stand for generations as a testament to his power. He saw it not as a temporary headquarters, but as the ancestral seat of a dynasty he was founding. The theater of power was all-consuming. The roles were fixed: the king, the queen, the princes, the court. Life inside 8515, the 159th Avenue, was a continuous, unblinking performance for an audience of rivals, law enforcement and the public. The pressure to maintain this facade, to never show a crack in the edifice of control, was immense. And so, the house stood at its zenith, a perfect, self-contained universe of power. It was a fortress against the law, a theater for the media, and a prison for its king. It radiated an aura of invincibility so absolute that it seemed to defy the laws of gravity, a structure whose immense weight was supported by nothing more than the sheer force of one man's will. Its very perfection was a form of hubris written in brick and mortar. The house was a statement that its owner was not subject to the same rules as other men, that he had built something beyond the reach of consequence. It was a silent, arrogant declaration that the reign would never end. No structure, however perfectly conceived, is immune to the slow, inexorable pressure of time and consequence. The first cracks to appear at 8515, the 159th Avenue, were not in the brickwork or the foundation, but in the very atmosphere that surrounded it. A subtle shift occurred in the quality of the silence. The confident, sovereign quiet of an untouchable reign was gradually replaced by a taut, watchful stillness, the kind that precedes a storm. The air grew heavy with the weight of unseen observation. The intimidating perfection of the property began to feel less like a statement of power and more like a desperate act of maintenance. The flawless lawn seemed brittle, the freshly painted trim a thin veneer over something strained. The house, once a living extension of its owner's ego, now seemed to be holding its breath, its facade a mask of composure stretched tight over a growing internal stress. It was the physical manifestation of an empire that had stopped expanding and was now focused solely on defending its borders. The pressure came from the outside, a slow, patient tightening of a technological net. The federal agents in their unmarked cars were no longer just a passive audience to the daily pageant of power. They were now armed with a new generation of surveillance equipment, their listening devices becoming more sensitive, their cameras more powerful. The fortress built to keep the world out was now encased in an invisible sphere of scrutiny, its every movement and sound subject to analysis. The owner's greatest weakness, the flaw that would ultimately compromise his fortress, was not a strategic error, but a psychological one. His pathological narcissism, the very engine of his ascent, now became the agent of his decay. He needed an audience. The quiet, conspiratorial confines of his own home were no longer enough to satisfy his craving for validation. The house was a throne room, but he increasingly craved a public stage. This need drove him from the relative security of his Howard Beach sanctuary to the more conspicuous setting of the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy. The club was a theater of nostalgia, a throwback to an older, more romanticized idea of the gangster. Within its walls, he could perform for his capos and soldiers, his voice echoing with the bravado of a man who believed his own myth. He confused the deference inside the club with the invincibility he felt inside his home. It was a fatal miscalculation. The house in Queens was a fortress designed and controlled entirely by him, its defenses woven into the very fabric of the community. The Ravenite was a shared space in a dense urban environment, a territory with vulnerabilities he failed to perceive. He believed the aura of his power was portable, that the magic that protected his home would follow him wherever he went. He was wrong. Frustrated by their inability to penetrate the sanctum in Howard Beach, federal investigators shifted their focus. They identified the owner's migratory pattern, his predictable need to hold court at the Ravenite. They discovered a strategic weakness, not in the club itself, but in the unassuming apartment of an elderly widow directly above it. There they achieved what they never could in Queens. They planted a bug. Suddenly, the walls had ears. But they were not the walls of the house, which had been built to be deaf and mute to the outside world. They were the walls of a nondescript Little Italy tenement, and they were recording everything. The most guarded secrets of the Gambino empire, conversations that were once confined to the soundproofed bubble of the house, or whispered during backyard walk and talks, were now being spoken freely into a government microphone. The owner, blinded by his own sense of impunity, delivered his own indictment. He was captured on tape discussing the intricate mechanics of his criminal enterprise, from bid rigging and extortion to the cold dismissal of human life. He ordered murders, berated subordinates, and, most critically, complained about his own underboss, Sammy Gravano. The voice that had once commanded an empire was now methodically documenting its own crimes. Within the house on 159th Avenue, the rituals of power continued, but they were now a hollow performance. The meetings in the kitchen, the audiences granted in the living room, the confident departures from the polished front door, all of it was rendered meaningless by the words being spoken miles away in Manhattan. The house had become a museum of a power that had already begun to hemorrhage. A hairline fracture appeared in the social foundation of the fortress. It was the corrosion of loyalty, the most critical component of its defense. The owner's recorded words, particularly his disparaging remarks about his most trusted lieutenant, began to circulate within the closed loop of the investigation. The bond of omerta, the sacred code of silence, was being dissolved by the acid of the owner's own ego. Sammy Gravano, the underboss, was the living embodiment of this internal crack. A man who had killed for his boss, who had stood as the staunchest pillar of his reign, now found himself a subject of his sovereign's contempt. He had crossed the threshold of that Howard Beach home countless times as a brother-in-arms, but the recordings revealed a different reality. In the cold calculus of the king, everyone was expendable. The betrayal was not a sudden act, but a slow, creeping realization. It was a poison that seeped into the organization from the top down. The men who had pledged their lives to the man in the house began to understand that his loyalty was only to himself. The fear they had once inspired in others was now eclipsed by the fear for their own survival in a collapsing structure. The house itself seemed to register this decay. A faint patina of neglect began to settle on its perfect surfaces. A weed, for the first time, might be seen for a day before being plucked. The constant humming energy of a functioning headquarters was replaced by the anxious, paranoid energy of a regime under siege. The structure was still standing, but its spirit was beginning to fail. The owner's public façade also began to show fissures. The confident smile for the cameras seemed more rigid, the expensive suits a kind of armor, rather than an expression of effortless style. His defiance started to sound like desperation. The man who had mastered the art of public performance was losing his audience, both on the street and within his own organization. The ultimate irony was that the fortress was not breached by a frontal assault. It was not taken by force, nor were its secrets extracted from its walls. The empire was undone from a distance by a simple microphone and the reckless vanity of the man who thought himself a god. The house was a perfect vessel, but it could not contain the destructive force of its owner's voice. The recordings became the ghost in the machine. They were an invisible, undeniable truth that haunted every conversation, every meeting. The trust that had been the invisible mortar holding the entire enterprise together had evaporated. All that remained was a collection of isolated, fearful men, bound together not by loyalty, but by the shared certainty of their impending doom. The most profound crack was psychological. The myth of the Teflon Don, the belief in his supernatural ability to evade the law, was shattered. Once that belief was gone, the power it conferred vanished with it. He was no longer a king, but merely a man, a vulnerable target who had talked himself into a cage. The house stood as a silent witness to this unraveling. Its windows, which had once looked out upon a kingdom with smug authority, now seemed to reflect a growing sense of dread. The structure, designed to project an image of absolute, permanent control, was now a monument to the transient nature of power built on fear and ego. The final days of the reign were filled with a heavy, suffocating silence inside the house. The flow of supplicants dwindled, the hushed conversations ceased. The fortress had become a tomb, waiting for an ending that had already been written and recorded. The cracks had spread from a single, compromised conversation to the very heart of the empire, and the entire edifice was ready to collapse. The end did not arrive as a gradual decline, but as a sudden overwhelming force of gravity. It came in the blue-grey light of a December dawn, a time when the quiet street was typically asleep, dreaming its suburban dreams. But on this morning the dream was shattered by the sound of engines, not the gentle hum of a passing car, but the coordinated, purposeful growl of a federal convoy. Doors opened in unison, and dark figures spilled onto the pavement, their movements precise and silent, a surgical invasion force descending upon the heart of a sleeping kingdom. The sovereign silence that had been the house's most potent weapon was broken. The air, once thick with deference, was now sliced by the sharp, staccato commands of law enforcement and the crackle of radios. A helicopter appeared overhead, its rhythmic thumping a sound not heard in this airspace since the grandest of the 4th of July fireworks displays. This time, however, the spectacle was not one of manufactured glory, but of systematic dismantlement. The fortress was officially under siege. The front door, that polished oaken threshold between two worlds, was no longer a symbol of controlled access. It was an obstacle to be breached. The brass fittings that had gleamed with the pride of an untouchable monarch now reflected the grim, determined faces of the men who had come to claim his throne. The percussive sound of a battering ram against the wood was an act of profound symbolic violence, a declaration that the laws of this house were now null and void. Neighbors, drawn to their windows by the commotion, watched in a state of suspended disbelief. The invisible wall of complicity they had helped maintain for years simply evaporated in the morning light. They were no longer participants in a local mythology, but spectators at a public execution. The power that had once seemed as permanent as the concrete sidewalk was being unmade before their eyes, revealing itself to be a fragile, temporary construct. Once inside, the agents moved with a cold, impersonal efficiency that was the antithesis of the house's carefully cultivated atmosphere of personal power. The living room, once a royal antechamber, became a federal staging ground. Its plush leather sofas were unceremoniously pushed aside, its gilded mirrors reflecting a scene of organized chaos. The family portraits on the walls looked down upon a violation their patriarch could no longer prevent. The desecration was methodical. The house was not treated as a home, but as a puzzle box, a container of secrets to be cracked open. Agents fanned out, their search warrants the only authority they needed. The structure that had been designed to project an aura of invincibility was now being turned inside out, its privacy and its dignity stripped away layer by layer. In the kitchen, the Empire's informal boardroom, the scene was one of clinical dissection. Cabinets were flung open, their contents examined and catalogued. The countertops, where multi-million-dollar schemes had been discussed over espresso, were now littered with evidence bags and forensic equipment. The heart of the house was being subjected to an autopsy, its lifeblood drained. The search for hidden spaces began. Agents tapped along walls, listening for the hollow sound that would betray a secret compartment. Floorboards were scrutinized, ceiling panels checked. The very architecture of the house, once a source of pride and control, was now treated with suspicion. as if the walls themselves were co-conspirators in the crimes they had silently witnessed. No space was sacred. The master bedroom, the owner's most intimate sanctuary, was subjected to the same dispassionate search. The closet, filled with the expensive suits that had defined his public persona, was emptied, each garment shaken down. The illusion of the dapper Don was dismantled, revealing only an empty uniform, its power having already fled. The material symbols of success were systematically neutralized. Paintings were taken down from walls, their backs examined. The expensive Italian marble of the foyer was scanned with electronic devices. A hidden safe, discovered behind a panel in a study, was not opened with a combination, but with the mechanical groan of a drill. Its contents, cash, jewelry, documents, spilling out under the harsh glare of a flashlight. This was a process of architectural humiliation. The house was being forced to give up secrets it may not have even held. The act of the search was the message. It was a demonstration that every lock could be broken, every wall could be breached, every carefully constructed symbol of power could be reduced to mere material for a federal investigation. In the backyard, the private stage for sensitive conversations was now a grid, meticulously combed by agents searching for buried items. The high privacy fence, once a formidable barrier against the outside world, now served only to contain the scene of the property's violation, hiding its shame from the curious eyes of the street. The physical deconstruction mirrored the social collapse that was already underway. As agents pried at the paneling inside, the owner's most trusted lieutenant was miles away, cooperating with the government, verbally dismantling the entire organization from a sterile interrogation room. The true demolition was happening elsewhere, through the spoken word. The house was a body, and it was being flayed. The search teams left a wake of controlled destruction, a landscape of overturned furniture, emptied drawers, and exposed wiring. They were looking for the tangible evidence of the empire, the ledgers, the weapons, the cash, but the true foundation of the enterprise had never been stored within its walls. When the agents finally withdrew, they left behind a profound silence. It was not the confident sovereign silence of the house's prime, but the hollow, echoing quiet of a desecrated tomb. The front door, now splintered and scarred, hung slightly ajar, a gaping wound that could not be closed. The structure remained, but it was a fundamentally different place. It was no longer a fortress or a throne, but merely a crime scene. Its aura of power had been exorcised by the mundane bureaucratic process of a federal raid. The magic was gone, leaving only brick, wood, and the stale air of a collapsed myth. The ultimate irony, discovered in the days and weeks that followed, was that the raid yielded very little of consequence. The definitive evidence, the words that would seal the owner's fate, had been captured through the air miles from this violated sanctuary. The house was a perfect fortress, but it had been built to defend against the wrong kind of attack. Its ruin was therefore not in the splintered door or the overturned furniture. The true ruin was in the shattering of the idea it represented. The house had been a monument to the belief that a man could build a world governed by his own rules, a world beyond the reach of consequence. And now it stood as proof that no wall is high enough to keep the real world out forever. So where does power truly reside? In concrete, or in what survives its fall? To understand what became of the house and the ghost of the empire it once contained, subscribe for the final act of our investigation. The years that followed the raid were a slow public dismantling. The conviction was a foregone conclusion, built not on evidence pried from the house's walls, but on the owner's own recorded voice. The sentence, life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole, was the final, legal seal on a tomb that had been under construction for years. The house on 159th Avenue was now the former home of a man who would never see a home again. It stood orphaned, its sovereign deposed, its purpose erased. Stripped of his tailored suits and his audience, the owner was transported to a world of concrete and steel, a landscape of absolute control that was not his own. The power he had projected was revealed to be entirely contextual, a force that could not survive beyond the perimeter of his neighborhood. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit environment of a federal prison medical center, his body began its own betrayal. The throat that had issued commands and condemned men was slowly silenced by cancer, a final biological mutiny. His death in 2002 was a quiet, clinical event, a footnote in a medical file, an end devoid of the operatic grandeur he had always craved. The house, too, faced a sentence. It could have been demolished, its foundations ripped from the earth to erase the memory it held. It could have been preserved, a morbid monument to a fallen king, a museum of a dark chapter in the city's history. Instead, it received a fate more profound and more unsettling. The family sold the property. It was not passed to another sovereign or claimed by the state. It was placed back onto the open market, a piece of real estate waiting for a new narrative. Today, a family lives within its walls. They mow the lawn, collect the mail, and watch the seasons change through its windows. The property has been returned to its original purpose, reabsorbed into the quiet rhythm of the community it once dominated. Its current state is an exercise in banality, a deliberate erasure of a past that feels almost impossible to reconcile with the placid scene. The house has become a vessel for a new, unremarkable history, its architecture scrubbed clean of the aura that once made it the most watched home in America. The sensory landscape of the street has been reset to its factory settings. The smell of meticulously manicured grass is just that, no longer mingling with the scent of power. The polished chrome of luxury sedans has been replaced by the practical steel of family minivans. The unnerving stillness of men in dark suits has given way to the ordinary, unchoreographed movements of neighbors taking out the trash or walking their dogs. The silence is no longer heavy with unspoken threats, but light with the absence of consequence. The dark wooden front door, once a potent symbol of access and exclusion, has been stripped of its authority. It is now simply an entrance, a piece of functional architecture. Children run through it without a thought, their small hands turning the same brass handle that was once the point of contact for an entire criminal empire. The threshold no longer separates two worlds. It merely separates a living room from a porch. Its symbolic life is over. The house itself seems to have exhaled, releasing the immense, volatile pressure it was built to contain. It no longer projects defiance or broadcasts invincibility. It simply stands, a participant in the quiet life of the block. Its complicity has been absolved by its return to normalcy. It has completed its arc, from a blank canvas of suburban aspiration to a fortress of criminal ego, and now, finally, to a silent repository of a history that feels increasingly like a ghost story. Yet, the memory lingers, not in the walls, but in the world outside them. The house has become an obligatory stop on the itinerary of true crime tourists. They slow their cars, point their phones, and take pictures of the façade, trying to capture an echo of the power that once radiated from it. They are searching for a darkness that has been painted over, a chill that has been warmed by the presence of a new family's life. The structure was never just a shelter. It was an argument. It was a physical manifestation of the belief that power, when wrapped in the symbols of domesticity and community, could become indestructible. It was a fortress built not against bullets, but against the owner's own origins, a monument to the boy from the Bronx who craved a space where his will was the only law. What the house ultimately became was a mirror, reflecting the profound fragility of the ego it was built to serve. Its intimidating perfection was a defense mechanism, its opulence a shield against a deep-seated fear of insignificance. The entire enterprise was an attempt to build something permanent out of the most transient materials: fear, loyalty, and charisma. On a quiet corner in Howard Beach, Queens, stands a house. It is a two-story structure of brick and siding, with a neatly kept lawn and a modest footprint, indistinguishable from the thousands of other homes that form the fabric of this working-class New York neighborhood. Its return to the ordinary is the final, haunting chapter of its story, a testament to how even the most formidable empires can be swallowed by the simple, relentless passage of time. Perhaps what we build says less about our power than about our fear of being erased. If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.